The workshop fell silent as the German engineer set down his calipers. He had measured every weld, tested every seal, dismantled every component of the captured Allied fuel container that sat on his workbench like an accusation. For 3 days, he and his team had subjected this simple metal can to every analysis their expertise could devise. Now, in the autumn of 1941, as Wehrmacht supply columns stretched across the Russian steppe and Rommel's Afrika Korps battled across North African deserts, this engineer faced a conclusion that made him physically uncomfortable. The enemy had built something better. Not a weapon, not a tank or aircraft or ship, a fuel can. And in that simple superiority lay a story that would haunt German logistics for the remainder of the war, a story of how the smallest details could determine the fate of armies, and how pride could blind even the most technically proficient nation to truths that should have been obvious. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The object of the engineer's consternation appeared deceptively simple. 20 litres of pressed steel, roughly rectangular, painted in whatever camouflage scheme its users required. British and Commonwealth forces called it the Jerrican, a name that would become one of history's peculiar ironies, for the design was originally German. Or rather, it had been German until Allied engineers encountered it, recognized its brilliance, copied it with improvements, and turned it into a weapon of logistics that would help win the war. The German original, the Wehrmacht Einheitskanister, had been a genuine innovation when introduced in 1937. 3 handles allowing 1 or 2 soldiers to carry it, an air pocket for expansion, internal X-shaped reinforcement that also allowed the cans to be stacked efficiently. But the Allied version sitting on that workbench had taken that foundation and refined it in ways that revealed just how much room for improvement had existed in what Germans had considered perfection. The engineer's report would be diplomatic, as such reports had to be. But the men in that workshop spoke more plainly among themselves. The British and American copies were superior in almost every measurable way. The seals were better, no leakage even after rough handling. The pouring spout was brilliant, a cam-locking mechanism with an air pipe that allowed smooth, splash-free pouring without removing the can from a vehicle. The construction was slightly more robust despite using the same gauge of steel. Most damning of all, these improvements were not complex innovations, requiring advanced metallurgy or manufacturing techniques. They were simple refinements that any competent engineer could have implemented, should have implemented, would have implemented if anyone in the Reich had been willing to admit that their initial design, approved at the highest levels, might benefit from reconsideration. This reluctance to acknowledge imperfection in approved designs had roots that extended far beyond fuel containers. The Third Reich had built itself on mythology, the mythology of Aryan superiority, of German technical excellence, of a 1,000-year empire rising from the humiliation of Versailles. These were not merely political slogans, they were articles of faith that permeated every level of society, every institution, every decision-making process. When you have declared yourself the master race, when you have staked your entire national identity on the premise of inherent superiority, the admission that the enemy might do something better becomes not merely embarrassing but ideologically threatening. A better fuel can is not just a better fuel can. It becomes evidence of a crack in the foundation of belief, a whisper of doubt that perhaps the grand narrative is not entirely accurate. The German military of 1941 was not incompetent. This fact must be stated clearly, because what follows is not a story of fools and idiots. The Wehrmacht that invaded the Soviet Union in June of that year was arguably the most professionally competent military force on the planet. Its officers were products of a military tradition that stretched back centuries. Its doctrine was revolutionary. Its combined arms tactics, the coordination of armor, infantry, artillery, and air power, represented a genuine innovation in warfare. Blitzkrieg was not just propaganda, it was a real operational concept that had swept aside the Polish army in weeks, conquered France in 6 weeks, and overrun Yugoslavia and Greece in a matter of days. These were real achievements by genuinely skilled professionals. But competence and excellence are not the same thing. Competence is the ability to execute tasks efficiently within an established framework. Excellence is the ability to question that framework, to recognize its limitations, to adapt and improve, even when doing so requires admitting that the framework was flawed. The German military had competence in abundance. What it increasingly lacked, as the war progressed, was the institutional humility necessary for excellence. And this lack would manifest in ways large and small, from strategic blunders at the highest levels to fuel cans that leaked precious gasoline into the Russian mud. The fuel supply problem was already becoming acute by the autumn of 1941, though few in Berlin were willing to acknowledge its severity. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, had been predicated on assumptions that were proving dangerously optimistic. The German High Command had expected to defeat the Red Army in a single campaign season, to capture Moscow before winter, to force Stalin's government into collapse or capitulation. These expectations had shaped logistics planning in fundamental ways. Supply lines had been stretched thin because the war was supposed to be short. Fuel reserves had been calculated based on distances that assumed Soviet resistance would crumble quickly. Alternative contingencies had been minimized because planning for a long campaign would have required admitting that a long campaign was possible, and such admission would have called into question the entire strategic premise of the invasion. Now, as autumn rains turned Russian roads into rivers of mud, as the Red Army proved far more resilient than anyone had predicted, as supply columns struggled to keep pace with advancing combat units, every litre of fuel became precious. And every litre lost to leaking containers, every minute wasted struggling with faulty closures, every gallon spilled during hurried refueling operations, these seemingly minor inefficiencies accumulated into a logistics catastrophe that would cripple German operations at the worst possible moment. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The British had encountered German fuel cans during the Norwegian campaign of 1940 and immediately recognized their superiority to the flimsy 2-gallon tins the British Army had been using. Those British tins were terrible, thin metal that dented easily, seals that leaked constantly, handles that cut into hands, a design that seemed calculated to waste fuel and frustrate soldiers. When British troops captured German cans in Norway, they sent samples back to London with enthusiastic recommendations. Here was something worth copying. The British Army's engineering staff agreed. They analysed the German design, identified its strengths, noted its weaknesses, and set about producing their own version with improvements. There was no ideological obstacle to this process. No British officer's worldview was threatened by the admission that the Germans had designed a good fuel container. It was simply a practical matter. The enemy had built something useful, so copy it and make it better. The American version, developed after the United States entered the war, took this process a step further. American industrial engineers, freed from the constraints of wartime shortages and working with the full capacity of the world's most advanced manufacturing economy, refined the design even more. They standardized dimensions for mass production. They improved the cam lock mechanism. They developed better sealing gaskets. They created manufacturing processes that could produce these cans by the millions without sacrificing quality. By 1943, Allied forces were using jerrycans. The name had stuck despite its origins in numbers that dwarfed German production. Every Allied vehicle in North Africa, in Italy, in the Pacific, and eventually in France, carried these containers. They became so ubiquitous that soldiers barely thought about them, which is the hallmark of good equipment. It works so reliably that it becomes invisible. German forces, meanwhile, continued to struggle with their original design and its various authorized modifications. The modifications themselves tell a story. When field units complained about leaking seals, the response was not to fundamentally redesign the seal, but to issue new specifications for gasket materials. When soldiers reported difficulty with the closure mechanism, the response was to provide additional training on proper closing procedures, not to redesign the mechanism. Each modification was a small adjustment within the approved framework, never a fundamental reconsideration of whether the framework itself needed changing. This approach was not unique to fuel containers. It was endemic to German military procurement and reflected a broader cultural pattern that would have profound consequences. The engineer in that workshop understood these dynamics, even if he could not speak them aloud. His report would note the superior Allied design features. It would recommend specific improvements to German production, but it would do so carefully, diplomatically, in language that did not directly criticize the decisions of superior officers or question the competence of the original design team. This caution was not mere politeness. By 1941, the Third Reich had thoroughly politicized technical expertise. Engineers and scientists who questioned approved designs or challenged established doctrine risked more than professional embarrassment. They risked accusations of defeatism, of undermining morale, of insufficient ideological commitment. In extreme cases, they risked far worse. This politicization of technical truth was not immediate or obvious. It had crept in gradually, the product of a system that valued loyalty over accuracy and ideological purity over empirical reality. In the early years of Nazi rule, Germany's scientific and engineering establishment had been world-class. German universities produced Nobel Prize winners. German industrial firms were at the forefront of chemical, electrical, and mechanical engineering. This excellence was real and substantial. But excellence requires freedom to question, to experiment, to fail, to admit error and try again. And freedom was precisely what the Nazi system could not tolerate. A totalitarian ideology demands certainty. It requires that the party, the leader, the approved doctrine be always correct. Doubt becomes disloyalty. Questions become subversion. The admission of error becomes an admission that the system itself might be flawed. The fuel can was a small thing. Individually, it barely mattered. But armies run on small things accumulated into vast logistical systems. A better fuel container meant less waste, faster refueling, more efficient supply operations, fewer vehicles sidelined by fuel shortages. Multiply these small efficiencies across hundreds of thousands of vehicles, millions of refueling operations, thousands of miles of supply lines, and the cumulative effect became substantial. The Allies did not win World War II because of fuel cans, but they won in part because of 10,000 small superiorities like the fuel can, each one a minor advantage that added up to overwhelming logistical dominance. German officers on the Eastern Front understood this arithmetic with increasing clarity as 1,941 turned to 1,942. They watched as their supply columns struggled through mud and snow, as vehicles ran dry within sight of fuel depots, as precious gasoline leaked away through faulty seals or spilled during chaotic refueling operations. They watched as captured Soviet equipment, crude and unsophisticated by German standards, nevertheless proved remarkably robust under harsh conditions. They watched as American Lend-Lease supplies began flowing to the Red Army in quantities that made German logistics look amateurish by comparison. And some of them began to understand that their assumptions about German technical superiority were not merely exaggerated, but dangerously wrong. This understanding came slowly and unevenly. The true believers never accepted it at all. They found other explanations: sabotage by defeatists, insufficient devotion to National Socialist principles, the machinations of international conspiracies. These explanations were comforting because they preserved the core mythology. If Germany's difficulties were caused by external enemies or internal traitors, then the fundamental premise of German superiority remained intact. The problem was not the system, but its corruption by hostile forces. This logic could explain any failure, rationalize any defeat, justify any atrocity committed in pursuit of the pure vision that always remained just out of reach. But for the engineer in that workshop, examining the Allied fuel can with professional detachment, such rationalizations offered no comfort. He was looking at physical evidence that could not be explained away. The welds were better. The seal was better. The pouring mechanism was better. These were facts, measurable and undeniable. And if the enemy could build a better fuel can, what else might they build better? What other assumptions might be wrong? How many other supposedly inferior opponents might possess capabilities that German intelligence had dismissed or overlooked? These questions had no safe answers in the autumn of 1941. The invasion of the Soviet Union had been launched on the assumption that the Red Army was a poorly led, badly equipped force that would collapse under the hammer blow of German military superiority. 3 months into the campaign, that assumption was proving catastrophically incorrect. Soviet forces were taking staggering casualties and losing vast territories, but they were not collapsing. They were trading space for time, falling back to new defensive lines, counterattacking where opportunities arose, learning from their defeats and adapting their tactics. Most disturbing of all, they were revealing industrial capabilities that German intelligence had grossly underestimated. Soviet tank production was not merely continuing but accelerating. New models were appearing that matched or exceeded German tanks in key categories. The same was true for artillery, aircraft, and small arms. The fuel can was a microcosm of this larger intelligence failure. German planners had assumed that Soviet industry was backward, that Soviet engineering was inferior, that Soviet production capacity was limited. These assumptions were partly true. Soviet consumer goods were indeed crude by Western standards. Soviet living conditions were harsh. Soviet technology in many civilian sectors lagged behind German capabilities. But military production was a different matter. The Soviet Union had spent the 1,930 seconds building an industrial base specifically designed for war production. Stalin's brutal 5-year plans, whatever their horrific human cost, had created factories that could produce tanks and artillery pieces in quantities that dwarfed German output. Soviet engineering in military applications was often brilliant, characterized by simplicity, reliability, and ease of mass production, exactly the qualities needed for total war. The German engineer examining the Allied fuel can was confronting a truth that extended far beyond his immediate technical analysis. The enemy was not inferior. In some ways, in ways that mattered for the actual conduct of war, the enemy was superior. This was not a comfortable realization for a man who had grown up in a society that taught him from childhood that Germans were the master race, that Slavs were subhuman, that Western democracies were decadent and weak. His education, his professional training, his entire cultural context had prepared him to expect German superiority as natural and inevitable. Now he held physical evidence that this expectation was wrong, and if it was wrong about fuel cans, what else might it be wrong about? The report he eventually submitted was professionally competent and carefully worded. It documented the superior features of the Allied design. It recommended specific improvements to German fuel container production. It noted the logistical advantages that these improvements would provide. What it did not do, what it could not do without risking his career and possibly his freedom, was draw the larger implications. It did not observe that the enemy's willingness to copy and improve German designs revealed a pragmatic flexibility that Germany lacked. It did not note that Allied logistics were demonstrating superiorities that suggested deeper industrial and organizational advantages. It did not question whether the ideological premises that governed German military planning might be fundamentally flawed. These unspoken observations circulated anyway, in quiet conversations among engineers and junior officers, in the sardonic humor of frontline troops, in the growing unease of logistics personnel who watched the gap between requirements and capabilities widen with each passing month. A culture of informal dissent was emerging among those close enough to the war's realities to see past the propaganda. They could not speak freely, but they could see clearly. And what they saw was troubling. Germany was fighting a war that required excellence in logistics, production, and adaptation. But the Nazi system could not produce excellence because excellence required admitting imperfection, and admitting imperfection contradicted the core ideology that justified the regime's existence. The fuel can sat on that workbench as a small symbol of a large problem. It was not the problem itself. The problem was strategic, ideological, systemic. But it represented the problem with perfect clarity. Here was a simple object that the enemy had made better through simple improvements that German engineers were perfectly capable of implementing, but which the system made difficult to acknowledge and adopt. Here was proof that the mythology of inherent German superiority was just that mythology. And here, in the growing gap between that mythology and operational reality, lay the seeds of eventual defeat. The winter of 1941 arrived with a ferocity that German planners had dismissed as exaggeration. Temperatures plunged to 40 degrees below zero, oil froze in engines, weapons jammed. Soldiers wrapped themselves in whatever cloth they could find because the Wehrmacht had not issued winter uniforms. The war was supposed to be over by now. And fuel, precious fuel that had travelled hundreds of miles from Reich refineries, disappeared into the frozen landscape through containers that cracked in the cold, through seals that failed under temperature extremes, through the accumulated inefficiencies of a logistics system designed for a short war now grinding through its first winter of what would become a 4-year nightmare. In heated warehouses far behind the lines, captured Allied, fuel cans sat unused, their superior design recognized but not adopted, because adoption would require admitting that the original German design was inadequate, and such admissions did not flow easily upward through a military hierarchy that confused loyalty with silence. The paralysis was not administrative laziness, it was structural. The German military procurement system had been designed for a different kind of war: short, decisive campaigns where initial superiority in training and doctrine could overwhelm opponents before logistical shortcomings became critical. This approach had worked in Poland, in France, in the Balkans. It was failing in Russia not because German soldiers lacked courage or skill, but because the fundamental assumptions underlying German strategy were wrong. The Soviet Union was too large, too populous, too industrially robust to be defeated quickly. The war Germany was actually fighting required exactly the kind of sustained logistical excellence that the Nazi system was structurally incapable of producing. Every litre of fuel lost to preventable waste was a small data point in this larger catastrophe, a tiny indicator of systemic dysfunction that would compound across millions of similar failures until entire army groups ground to a halt for lack of supplies that existed, but could not reach the front efficiently. American observers watching German operations in 1942 noted this dysfunction with professional interest. U.S. Army logistics officers studying intelligence reports recognized that German supply operations, while competent in execution, were hamstrung by equipment deficiencies that Allied forces had already solved. The fuel can became a teaching example in logistics courses, not because it was uniquely important, but because it illustrated a principle that applied across all military operations. Small improvements in basic equipment, multiplied across entire armies, produced advantages larger than any single technological breakthrough. The officer who could shave 5 minutes off every refueling operation, reduce fuel waste by 2%, increase container durability by 10%, that officer contributed more to victory than the engineer who designed a tank that was slightly faster or a gun that was marginally more powerful. War was won in the accumulation of such advantages, in the grinding arithmetic of supply operations that kept armies moving while their opponents stalled. The Germans understood arithmetic, their educational system was excellent, their engineers were trained to high standards, their military officers studied logistics as seriously as they studied tactics. But understanding arithmetic and accepting its implications are different things. The implications of the fuel can problem were clear to anyone willing to see them. Germany was losing the logistics war, and losing it for reasons that were preventable but not prevented, because prevention required institutional flexibility that the Nazi system could not provide. Junior officers saw this, frontline troops saw this, supply personnel saw it most clearly of all. But the information did not flow upward effectively because upward information flow in authoritarian systems is always filtered by fear. No one wanted to be the bearer of bad news. No one wanted to suggest that approved procedures were inadequate. No one wanted to risk being labeled defeatist or insufficiently committed to final victory. This failure of information flow had consequences that extended far beyond fuel containers. German intelligence consistently underestimated Allied production capacity because reports that challenged optimistic assumptions were unwelcome. German strategic planning consistently overestimated the Wehrmacht's capabilities because pessimistic assessments were dismissed as cowardice. German tactical doctrine consistently failed to adapt to changing battlefield conditions because adaptation required admitting that previous doctrine had been flawed. Each of these failures had roots in the same cultural dysfunction, a system that valued ideological purity over empirical accuracy, that confused criticism with betrayal, that could not tolerate the kind of honest assessment that effective military operations require. By 1943, the logistics differential between German and Allied forces had become stark. American factories were producing jerrycans by the millions, along with trucks, spare parts, and every other item necessary for mechanized warfare at a scale that German industry could not match. British supply operations in North Africa demonstrated efficiency that German commanders could only envy. Soviet logistics, crude but effective, were keeping the Red Army supplied despite the catastrophic losses of 1,941 and 1,942. Germany, meanwhile, was fighting a multi-front war with a logistics system designed for single-front campaigns, using equipment that was often excellent in individual capability, but inadequate in aggregate supply. The fuel can was just one example among thousands, but it was a telling one, a simple item where German engineering had produced a good initial design, but Allied engineering had produced something better, and German institutional rigidity had prevented the obvious solution of simply copying the improvements. The copying would have been easy. The Allies had not patented their improvements. Industrial espionage was unnecessary when captured equipment provided complete blueprints. German factories had the capacity and expertise to produce identical cans. What they lacked was authorization to do so, because authorization required bureaucratic mechanisms that moved slowly when they moved at all, and because such authorization implicitly admitted that the current approved design was inferior, which was an admission that rippled upward through chains of command, where no one wanted to be associated with previous inadequate decisions. So German forces continued using inferior containers, continued losing fuel to preventable waste, continued struggling with logistics problems that had known solutions that were not implemented because implementation required a kind of institutional humility that totalitarian systems cannot produce. The soldiers on the front lines made their own accommodations. They captured Allied fuel cans whenever possible and used them preferentially over German issue. They traded with each other for the better containers. They became experts at identifying which captured equipment was worth keeping and which was worth discarding. This informal procurement system worked after a fashion, but it was anarchic and unreliable. Units with aggressive supply sergeants who prioritized captured equipment did better than units that relied solely on official channels. Elite formations received priority allocations and could supplement with captured material. Regular infantry divisions made do with whatever they could scavenge. The resulting inequality in supply quality became yet another factor in the gradual degradation of German military effectiveness units that should have been equivalent in capability diverged, based on factors that had nothing to do with official planning and everything to do with individual initiative that operated despite the system rather than because of it. This pattern repeated across countless categories. German soldiers preferred captured Soviet PP submachine guns to their own MP-40s in close combat. They valued American sea rations over German field rations. They sought Soviet felt boots for winter operations when German boots proved inadequate. Each preference was a small admission that the enemy had made better choices, that German superiority was not universal, that the mythology of inherent racial and cultural advantage was demonstrably false in practical application. These lessons were learned at squad level, at company level, at battalion level. They filtered upward slowly, if at all, because the system actively resisted information that contradicted approved narratives. The engineers who had examined the Allied fuel can, in 1941, watched this process with professional frustration that they could not voice openly. They had written their reports, they had documented the superior features, they had recommended adoption of improvements. Their reports had been filed, acknowledged, and effectively ignored, not through malice or stupidity, but through bureaucratic inertia and ideological inflexibility. The improvements would have required retooling factories, rewriting specifications, revising procurement contracts, admitting that resources had been wasted on inferior designs. Each step was possible in isolation. In aggregate, they required a kind of systemic flexibility that the Reich simply did not possess. So, the better design remained unadopted, while German forces struggled with equipment that everyone recognized as inferior, but no one had the authority or political capital to replace. The Americans, by contrast, had institutionalized the process of continuous improvement. U.S. Army logistics personnel were encouraged to report equipment deficiencies. Field modifications that proved effective were evaluated and often incorporated into standard production. Soldiers' suggestions were solicited and sometimes implemented. This was not because Americans were inherently more innovative or intelligent than Germans. It was because the American system rewarded practical problem-solving and did not punish criticism of approved equipment. When an American officer reported that a piece of equipment was inadequate, he was asking for a solution. When a German officer made the same report, he was implicitly criticizing his superior's judgment. The different organizational cultures produced different outcomes. American equipment evolved rapidly through iterative improvement. German equipment stagnated because iteration required admitting imperfection. The fuel can. The story reached its peculiar culmination in 1944, when Allied forces landed in Normandy carrying millions of jerrycans, the name now universal, despite its ironic origins to support operations in France. German forces retreating across the same territory abandoned their own inferior containers in favor of captured Allied equipment whenever possible. The symbolic reversal was complete. German soldiers were now preferentially using Allied copies of an originally German design because the copies were better than the originals, and their own supply system could not or would not provide them with equivalent equipment. This was not a catastrophic failure in itself. Battles are not won or lost over fuel containers, but it was symptomatic of the larger systemic failures that were ensuring German defeat. Those systemic failures extended to strategic decision-making at the highest levels. Hitler's refusal to allow tactical retreats, his insistence on holding untenable positions, his interference in operational planning, these were manifestations of the same inability to accept unpleasant realities that prevented adoption of better fuel can designs. The connection was not causal, but cultural. A system that could not admit error in small things could not admit error in large things. A leadership that confused flexibility with weakness, that treated adaptation as betrayal, that valued ideological purity over practical effectiveness, such leadership was structurally incapable of the kind of strategic adjustment that successful war-making requires. Germany was not defeated because of fuel cans. Germany was defeated because of the cultural and institutional dysfunctions that the fuel can story illustrated in miniature. The engineer who had examined the Allied fuel can in 1941 survived the war, though the Germany he had known did not. In the decades that followed, he occasionally told the story to students and colleagues, using it as a teaching example about the importance of institutional humility and the dangers of ideological rigidity. The story was small enough to be comprehensible, specific enough to be memorable, and illustrative enough to carry larger lessons about how organizations succeed or fail. Good equipment matters, he would say, but the culture that produces good equipment matters more. Technical excellence requires the freedom to question, to experiment, to acknowledge mistakes and learn from them. Any system that confuses criticism with disloyalty, that treats adaptation as admission of failure, that values conformity over accuracy, such a system will eventually produce inferior results, no matter how talented its individual members might be. The Jerrican itself became one of the iconic pieces of equipment from World War II, so successful that the basic design remains in use today. Modern fuel containers still incorporate the features that Allied engineers refined in the early 1942s, the three handles, the cam lock closure, the internal reinforcement, the air pipe for smooth pouring. These features work as well now as they did 80 years ago because they solve fundamental problems in simple, elegant ways. Good design is often like that, not flashy or complicated, but effective and enduring. The Germans had come close to achieving such design in 1937. The Allies had achieved it by 1941. The difference was not genius versus stupidity. It was a willingness to iterate, to improve, to acknowledge that even good designs could be made better. The story of the fuel can is ultimately a story about how organizations learn or fail to learn. Military organizations must learn constantly because war is the most demanding teacher, punishing mistakes with catastrophic consequences and rewarding adaptation with survival. The Allied forces during World War II created institutional mechanisms for continuous learning after-action reports, lessons learned programs, rapid equipment modification processes, channels for upward communication of battlefield realities. These mechanisms were imperfect and often bureaucratic, but they functioned. They allowed information to flow upward, problems to be acknowledged, solutions to be implemented. The German military had similar formal mechanisms, but they were compromised by a political system that could not tolerate certain kinds of truth, that treated realistic assessment as defeatism, that valued loyalty over accuracy. The technical superiority of the Allied fuel can was real and measurable, but its deeper significance was cultural. It represented a system that could acknowledge when the enemy did something better, that could set aside pride and copy good ideas regardless of their source, that valued practical effectiveness over ideological purity. These were not minor advantages. In the aggregate, across thousands of similar decisions about equipment, tactics, and strategy, they produced the overwhelming logistical and industrial dominance that ensured Allied victory. Germany fought World War II with courage, skill, and technical proficiency. But proficiency is not enough when the system producing that proficiency cannot adapt, cannot learn, cannot acknowledge its own limitations. The engineer's workshop in 1941 was a microcosm of this larger reality. The captured fuel can sat on the workbench as physical evidence that the enemy had built something better. The engineer's professional skill allowed him to understand why it was better. His technical knowledge would have allowed him to recommend improvements that matched or exceeded Allied capabilities. But the system in which he worked could not easily implement such improvements because implementation required admissions that the system found difficult to make. So the report was filed, the evidence was acknowledged, and the inferior design remained in production because changing it was politically and bureaucratically complicated in ways that technical superiority could not overcome. This is the lesson that echoes across the decades. Technical excellence matters enormously, but it is not sufficient. The culture and institutions that enable technical excellence matter even more. A brilliant engineer working within a rigid system will produce inferior results compared to a competent engineer working within a flexible system that encourages iteration and improvement. The Allied fuel can was better than the German original, not because Allied engineers were smarter, but because they worked within organizational cultures that encouraged them to question, improve, and adapt without fear of ideological consequences. That cultural advantage, multiplied across every category of military equipment and every level of strategic planning, proved decisive. The small fuel container tells a large story, a story of how pride can blind even the talented to necessary truths, how ideology can compromise even sophisticated institutions, how the refusal to acknowledge imperfection guarantees eventual failure. It is a story worth remembering not because fuel cans determine history, but because the principles they illustrate apply universally. Organizations that cannot learn, that cannot adapt, that cannot acknowledge when others have found better solutions, such organizations will eventually be surpassed by those who can. The advantage does not require genius. It requires humility, flexibility, and the willingness to admit that even the best designs can be improved, that even trusted assumptions can be wrong, that excellence is not a destination but a process of continuous refinement that never ends. The Allied forces understood this truth. The German forces, trapped within an ideology that could not tolerate such understanding, learned it too late to matter. The war was decided by many factors, but this difference in institutional culture was among the most fundamental, and the humble Jerrican remains its most eloquent symbol. The testimony came decades after the war, in an industrial design conference in Stuttgart, where veteran engineers gathered to discuss the evolution of military logistics. An elderly man rose during the question period, his hands still steady despite his age, and described the moment in 1941 when he had first examined the Allied fuel container. His voice carried the weight of memory, but also something else, a kind of rueful wisdom that comes from understanding. Too late. Lessons that could have changed everything. He spoke of the measurements he had taken, the features he had documented, the recommendations he had written. Then he paused and said something that silenced the room. We knew it was better. Everyone knew. But knowledge without the freedom to act on knowledge is just another form of ignorance, and perhaps more dangerous because it carries the illusion of wisdom. The room remained quiet long after he sat down, because everyone present understood that he was not merely describing fuel containers, he was describing the anatomy of institutional failure, and the price that nations pay when pride becomes more important than truth. The post-war analysis of German logistics revealed patterns that historians would study for generations. The Wehrmacht had possessed, on paper, one of the most sophisticated supply systems ever designed. German logistics officers had trained extensively. Their planning was meticulous. Their understanding of supply chain mathematics was excellent. Yet the system consistently underperformed relative to Allied logistics that appeared less sophisticated but proved more effective. The explanation was not incompetence, but inflexibility. German logistics planning assumed conditions that rarely existed in practice: rail lines that remained intact, roads that stayed passable, supply depots that operated on schedule, equipment that performed to specification. When reality diverged from assumptions, the system struggled to adapt, because adaptation required acknowledging that the assumptions had been wrong, and such acknowledgement rippled upward through command structures where optimistic assessments were expected and pessimistic realities were unwelcome. The contrast with Allied logistics was instructive. American supply operations, in particular, were characterized by redundancy, flexibility, and continuous adjustment. American logistics officers expected things to go wrong and planned accordingly. They overestimated requirements rather than underestimating them. They built slack into schedules rather than assuming best-case scenarios. They encouraged field reports of equipment deficiencies and actually acted on those reports. This approach was not inherently superior in theoretical efficiency. In fact, it appeared wasteful by German standards. But it proved vastly more effective in practice because war is inherently chaotic, and systems designed for ideal conditions fail when confronted with messy reality. The American approach accepted messiness as inevitable and built systems robust enough to function despite it. The German approach demanded order and struggled when order proved impossible to maintain. The fuel can story became a case study in this contrast. Allied forces had identified a problem: inadequate fuel containers, and solved it through straightforward copying and improvement of a German design. The solution required no breakthrough innovation, just practical engineering and willingness to adopt good ideas, regardless of their origin. German forces had identified the same problem when examining captured Allied containers, had documented the superior features, and then failed to implement the obvious solutions because implementation required bureaucratic processes that moved slowly and political acknowledgements that were uncomfortable. Both sides had access to the same information. One side acted on it effectively. The other side did not. The difference was not intelligence or capability, but institutional culture. This difference manifested across every category of military equipment. Allied aircraft designs evolved rapidly through multiple iterations, each incorporating lessons from combat experience. German aircraft designs, often brilliant in initial conception, evolved more slowly because changes required approval processes that were lengthy and politically fraught. Allied tanks went through continuous improvement cycles that addressed field-reported deficiencies. German tanks became increasingly complex and difficult to manufacture, chasing theoretical perfection while sacrificing practical producibility. Allied infantry weapons prioritized reliability and ease of production. German infantry weapons often achieved superior individual performance, but at the cost of manufacturing complexity that limited quantities. In each case, the Allied approach accepted good enough today over perfect tomorrow, while the German approach pursued excellence at the cost of adaptability. The human cost of these institutional differences was immense. German soldiers fought with courage and skill that Allied commanders grudgingly respected. But they fought increasingly with inadequate supply, obsolescent equipment, and strategic direction that ignored battlefield realities. The diesel fuel that could have reached frontline units leaked away through faulty containers. The winter clothing that could have prevented frostbite casualties remained unissued because admitting the need for winter clothing meant admitting the war would not end quickly. The tactical retreats that could have preserved combat power were forbidden because retreat implied weakness, and weakness contradicted the narrative of inevitable victory. Each decision, made by officers who were individually competent and often personally brave, contributed to a cascade of failures that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. The soldiers themselves understood the disconnection between official narratives and lived experience. Letters home, intercepted by Allied intelligence and carefully analyzed, revealed a growing cynicism about official pronouncements. Frontline troops stopped believing the propaganda about imminent victory. They noted the increasing superiority of Allied equipment. They compared their own diminishing rations with captured Allied supplies. They counted the growing disparity in air support, artillery ammunition, and replacement personnel. These observations circulated in the informal networks that exist in any army, the conversations between soldiers during quiet moments, the dark humor that helped men cope with impossible situations, the unspoken understanding that official truth and actual truth were not the same thing. This growing awareness created a peculiar psychological burden. German soldiers were fighting for a cause that increasing numbers of them recognized as doomed, within a system that punished honest assessment of that doom. They could not discuss their doubts openly without risking severe consequences. Yet the doubts gnawed at morale in ways that official optimism could not counteract. The cognitive dissonance between what they were told and what they experienced created a kind of spiritual exhaustion that complemented the physical exhaustion of continuous combat. They continued fighting, because soldiers fight, because retreat was not authorized, because the consequences of surrender or desertion were severe, because camaraderie and unit cohesion persisted, even as faith in ultimate victory eroded. But they fought with the knowledge that their efforts were delaying inevitable defeat rather than securing possible victory, and that knowledge shaped the character of the war's final years. The fuel can, in this context, became more than a logistics item. It became a symbol of the gap between what German soldiers were told and what they experienced. They were told that German engineering was superior. They experienced Allied equipment that worked better. They were told that final victory was certain. They experienced defeats that contradicted that certainty. They were told that their sacrifices were necessary for a glorious future. They experienced suffering that seemed increasingly pointless as the strategic situation deteriorated. The small betrayals accumulated the equipment that failed, the supplies that never arrived, the promises that proved empty, the plans that bore no relationship to reality. Each betrayal was minor in isolation. In aggregate, they destroyed the foundation of trust between soldiers and the system that commanded them. The Allied soldiers using jerrycans gave little thought to their fuel containers because the containers worked reliably. This unremarkability was itself significant. Good logistics is invisible logistics systems that function so smoothly that soldiers can focus on their actual missions rather than struggling with equipment deficiencies. Allied forces could take for granted that fuel would arrive, that containers would not leak, that refueling would proceed efficiently. This allowed them to concentrate on tactical challenges rather than supply crises. German forces, by contrast, had to devote increasing attention to logistics problems that should have been solved at systemic level. Unit commanders became supply scavengers. Combat troops spent time requisitioning and transporting supplies that should have flowed automatically. The cumulative drain on time, attention, and morale was substantial, even though no single incident was catastrophic. The post-war German economic miracle, the rapid reconstruction and industrial success of West Germany, demonstrated that German engineering capability had not been inferior. German industry in the 1,950 seconds and 1,960 seconds produced equipment that was genuinely world-class and earned global reputation for quality. German companies became synonymous with precision, reliability, and excellence. This success revealed that the wartime logistics failures had not stemmed from lack of technical skill, but from institutional and cultural factors that the post-war democratic system had addressed. Free from ideological constraints that punished honest assessment, free to copy good ideas from any source, free to acknowledge mistakes and learn from them, German engineering could flourish. The talent had always been present. What changed was the system within which that talent operated. This realization offers perhaps the most important lesson from the fuel can story. Human potential exists in abundance across cultures, nations, and circumstances. What varies is the degree to which systems allow that potential to flourish. The German engineers of 1941 were not less capable than the Allied engineers who improved the Jerrican design. They were operating within a system that made it difficult to acknowledge that improvement was needed, difficult to implement improvements once identified, difficult to communicate problems upward through command structures that did not welcome uncomfortable truths. The Allied engineers operated within systems that, while far from perfect, were more permeable to feedback, more willing to acknowledge deficiencies, more capable of rapid iteration based on field experience. The implications extend far beyond military logistics. Any organization, military, corporate, governmental, academic, faces similar challenges. How does information flow? Are problems acknowledged or concealed? Is criticism treated as disloyalty or as valuable feedback? Can the organization adapt when circumstances change? These questions determine organizational effectiveness more powerfully than individual brilliance or technical skill. A mediocre organization staffed by brilliant individuals will underperform. An excellent organization staffed by competent individuals will overperform. The difference lies in systems, culture, and the degree to which the organization can learn from experience without filtering that experience through ideology or pride. The elderly engineer at the Stuttgart conference understood this truth with the clarity that comes from having lived through failure. His generation had been taught that German superiority was inherent, that Aryan racial characteristics guaranteed excellence, that defeat was impossible for a properly National Socialist nation. These teachings had proved catastrophically wrong, and the wrongness had been evident to anyone willing to see it from the early stages of the war. The fuel can was just one small piece of evidence among thousands, but it was concrete and undeniable. The enemy had built something better. No amount of ideological faith could change that physical reality. Yet the system could not easily respond to that reality, because responding required admissions that the ideology did not permit. His generation's failure, he told the conference, was not technical, but moral. They had possessed the knowledge to identify problems and the skill to solve them. What they had lacked was the courage to insist on truth over comfort, to risk consequences by reporting realities that contradicted approved narratives, to place professional integrity above personal safety. Some had tried and paid severe prices. Others had remained silent and lived with different kinds of costs, the weight of knowing they had not spoken when speaking might have mattered, the burden of complicity with a system they recognized as failing, the question of whether earlier and more forceful truth-telling might have prevented at least some of the catastrophe that followed. These were not questions with comfortable answers, which is perhaps why they needed to be asked. The fuel can itself, preserved in museums and military collections around the world, serves as a tangible reminder of these questions. Visitors can examine the design, note the features that made it effective, read the explanatory plaques describing its history. But the real story is not in the variateur, metal and welds. It is in what the metal and welds represent the difference between systems that can learn and systems that cannot, between organizations that permit truth and organizations that demand conformity, between cultures that accept imperfection as part of improvement and cultures that treat acknowledgement of imperfection as betrayal. These differences determine outcomes at every level of human endeavor, from the smallest logistics detail to the grandest strategic vision. The generation that fought World War II is largely gone now. The engineers who examined captured equipment, the soldiers who struggled with inadequate supplies, the commanders who made decisions based on ideological constraints rather than operational realities, they have passed into history. But the lessons remain relevant because the underlying dynamics remain constant. Organizations still face the temptation to value loyalty over accuracy, to confuse criticism with betrayal, to demand optimism when realism is needed. Leaders still face the choice between comfortable narratives and uncomfortable truths. Systems still must choose between rigid adherence to approved methods and flexible adaptation to changing circumstances. These choices will always exist, and they will always matter. The Fuelcan story offers no simple formula for making these choices correctly. Human organizations are complex, circumstances vary, and what works in one context may fail in another. But the story does offer a principle worth remembering, that the willingness to acknowledge imperfection is not weakness, but the foundation of improvement, that the ability to learn from others regardless of source is strength, not surrender, that systems which permit honest assessment of reality will outperform systems that demand adherence to ideology, regardless of how talented the individuals within those systems might be. These insights were purchased at terrible cost in the 1,940 seconds. They remain available to any organization wise enough to learn from history rather than repeating it. The humble Jerrican, still in use today, still reliable, still effective, stands as quiet testimony to the enduring value of practical engineering freed from ideological constraint. It does the job it was designed to do without fanfare or complexity. It works because Allied engineers were free to copy a good German idea and make it better, because they operated within systems that rewarded practical improvement over theoretical purity, because effectiveness mattered more than pride. That simple metal container, produced by the millions, carried the fuel that powered the vehicles that won the war. Not because it was a wonder weapon, but because it was a small thing done right, multiplied across an entire logistics system that valued getting things right over maintaining comfortable illusions. In that multiplication of small things done right lies perhaps the most important lesson of all, that excellence emerges not from grand gestures, but from systematic attention to detail, from willingness to learn, from cultures that permit honest assessment and reward practical improvement. These qualities built the Jerrican. These qualities won the war. These qualities remain as valuable now as they were then, waiting for organizations wise enough to embrace them. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.